At 20 minutes to 6 on a Sunday morning in Asheville Landing, Rhode Island, an orange bulldozer rolled over the wooden fence outside a 30-seat diner called the Copper Spoon, and Delaney Quinn came running out the front door still holding a hot skillet. She was 28 years old, a widow raising a 6-year-old daughter alone, and she'd unlocked those doors before 5 every morning for 6 years straight. Roderick Halstead watched from beside his black SUV with a paper coffee cup in his hand. 47 years old, gray suit, steel watch, a developer who hadn't lost a property fight in over a decade and didn't intend to start losing to a woman with no lawyer and no money. When the east wall folded inward, hundreds of small yellow paper slips tore loose from the wall behind the counter and lifted into the headlights, and a hand-carved board with an old copper spoon bolted to it landed face down in the mud. Halstead turned it over with his shoe, read what was burned into the wood, and set his heel right in the middle of it. He told her kindness doesn't show up on a balance sheet. He told her that wasn't a memorial, sweetheart, that was firewood. And Delaney went down on her knees in the mud with both hands flat on that board, and she couldn't lift it. Halstead checked his watch and turned back toward his car, satisfied, already thinking about the ribbon cutting. He never once looked up the road. 40 yards behind him, a black car had been sitting with its engine off for 2 minutes, and the man inside had watched every second of it. Dark hair, gray eyes, a faded scar along the left side of his jaw, 34 years old. Delaney had been pouring that man coffee every Tuesday morning for 3 years and had never once asked his name. She'd called him twice in her life. The second time was 44 minutes ago. In the state of Rhode Island, he was the last man alive you'd ever want parked across the street, and Roderick Halstead had just made the only mistake that couldn't be undone. If this story moves you, hit that like button and share it with someone who believes decency still counts for something. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to where all of this really began. But to understand why a woman would kneel in the mud for a wooden sign, you have to go back to the ordinary mornings that came before it. Mornings with nothing memorable about them. Mornings repeated so many times that Delaney herself had long since stopped counting. At 4:45, the road along the harbor was still dark and damp, and Delaney Quinn slipped the key into the front door lock with the practiced motion of someone who had done it thousands of times and no longer needed to look. She pushed the door open with her shoulder, because the bottom hinge had been crooked for years, stepped into the darkness, and didn't turn on the lights right away. She walked straight past the counter, went around into the kitchen, opened the gas valve, lit the large burner first and the small one after it, set the coffee pot on the stove, and only when she heard the water beginning to murmur did she reach up and switch on the row of ceiling lights. The copper spoon emerged beneath its pale yellow glow, 30 chairs, a low tin roof, and a line of windows looking out over the old fishing boats moored in the fog. The counter was made of aged oak, and in the middle of it was a dark burn mark shaped like a hand that no amount of scrubbing could erase. The mark left behind from the morning Elias dropped the cast-iron skillet and caught it on instinct. He had laughed and said to leave it there, because someday the customers would ask about it. No customer ever did, but Delaney still wiped that spot more carefully than any other. A few minutes before 6, the door opened for the first time that day. The fisherman took the second stool from the entrance without saying a word, and Delaney set his coffee in front of him before he had even taken off his cap. A few minutes later came the 2 long-haul truck drivers, who always sat at the table by the window so they could keep an eye on their rigs. At 6:45, the nurse finishing her night shift walked in with reddened eyes, took her usual place at the far end of the counter, and Delaney poured her a glass of cold water before bringing the coffee, because the woman had once said that after 12 hours in the hospital, the first thing she needed was water. Beatrice Kovac arrived later, sat at table number 4, unfolded the local newspaper, and read it as though she were still the person responsible for approving every line. Everyone had a place, and Delaney never had to ask what anyone wanted. But the table she wiped first, before the counter, before the kitchen, was the one where no one sat. Table number 7 stood in the farthest corner, its back to the wall and its view fixed directly on the door. She wiped the tabletop, cleaned even the underside of the chair rails, straightened the toothpick holder, and left everything exactly that way. On some Tuesday mornings, the diner became so crowded that people had to wait outside on the porch, and table number 7 remained empty. No one in the diner ever asked why. The fisherman had been coming there long enough to know that some questions didn't need to be asked. The nurse believed it had belonged to Delaney's late husband, and she never spoke that thought aloud. Only Beatrice Kovac, who had spent her entire life making a profession of asking questions, knew that it wasn't the place of a man who had died, but the place of a man who was still alive, and she too chose to say nothing. At 7 o'clock, the bell above the door rang once more, and that man walked in, removed his black wool coat, and sat down in the chair with its back to the wall. Delaney poured him black coffee without asking, and set it before him. He gave a slight nod. She returned to the kitchen, stood before the large stove, and retied the apron strings behind her back. The way Delaney knew what people wanted before they had to ask, the way she remembered who needed water before coffee, and who needed to sit where they could see their truck, wasn't something she had learned in a diner. It was something a child learned when she had to read the minds of adults, in order to know how much longer she would be allowed to stay. Her mother left when she was too young to remember her face, leaving behind only the faint memory of a voice and the smell of cigarette smoke clinging to a sweater. After that came the houses, one after another, in a factory town in the northern part of the state. A few seasons in each place, some kind, some simply too busy for anyone to notice her. No one treated her badly. It was only that no one kept her. And a child who moved often learned exactly two things. The first was how to pack her entire life into a single bag in less time than anyone would imagine. The second was never to hang photographs on the wall, because taking them down always hurt more than never putting them up at all. At 19, she waited tables on the night shift at a roadside diner not far from there, working from 10 o'clock at night until 6 in the morning and sleeping in a rented room above a laundromat. They hired her quickly because she moved fast and didn't ask many questions. And during all those months, no one there ever asked her anything that wasn't related to work. Not until the night a new cook came in for the overnight shift. He was tall and thin, with flour always clinging to his hands, and when he saw her standing by the sink at 3 o'clock in the morning, hurriedly eating a slice of cold bread, he didn't tell her to move faster or ask whether she could handle the job. He asked her what she liked to eat. Delaney stood there for a long time without answering, because the truth was that she had never thought about it. All her life, she had eaten whatever people gave her, whatever was left over, whatever was quickest. He waited without pressing her, then said she could tell him the next time she figured it out. 3 nights later, she told him she liked eggs, fried with the yolks still a little soft. And from that night on, at 3 o'clock every morning, a plate of eggs was waiting in the corner of the kitchen, and neither of them said a word about it. His name was Elias Quinn. They were married at City Hall on a Wednesday afternoon, with no celebration, no guests, and not a single photograph taken. When the clerk finished reading the vows, she asked whether they wanted a picture, and Elias said they didn't need one because he would remember. Delaney regretted it later, but she also understood why she had agreed at the time, because for someone who had never possessed anything worth holding on to, having nothing to lose could feel like a kind of safety. They bought the abandoned warehouse at the corner of the Harbor Road through a tax auction, for so little that no one bothered to bid against them, because the roof leaked, the foundation was cracked, and the entire row of buildings around it was slowly dying along with the fishing boats. Elias spent more than a year repairing it, working late every night after his shift ended, while Delaney kept waiting tables through the night to pay for the materials. She remembered the sound of his hammer carrying through the thin walls of their rented room, steady as a heartbeat, and the smell of sawdust clinging to his hair no matter how many times he washed it. He reinforced the eastern support beam himself with square steel tubing, laid the floor again with his own hands, and when everything was nearly finished, he sat on the porch for an entire evening, carving the wooden sign that would hang above the door. He fastened his grandmother's old copper spoon to it, the spoon worn thin along one side because she had used it all her life, and beneath it he carved a single line into the wood. Delaney asked why he didn't make the name of the place larger, and he shook his head and said people would read a name and forget it, but someone would need to read that line on exactly the right morning of their life. He never called the place a restaurant, and he didn't call it a diner. He called it a place where people could sit down. The diner had been open for only a few seasons when Delaney became pregnant, and the morning she heard her daughter's heart beating for the first time was also the last morning she was still Elias Quinn's wife. She went to the appointment alone that day because Elias had to work the breakfast shift, and he said Thursday mornings were always crowded, that he would come with her next time. Absolutely next time. She lay on the examination table covered in white paper, her belly already rounded at 5 months, while the technician moved the probe across her skin and then stopped. A sound came from the machine. Quick, urgent, and steady, like someone running. Delaney asked what it was, and the technician told her it was her little girl's heart. She lay still and listened, and during those moments, she found herself thinking something almost foolish, that all her life she had never belonged to anyone, that no one had ever been required to remember her, and yet now there was another heart beating inside her, and that heart wasn't going anywhere. The telephone in her coat pocket began to vibrate. She heard it but didn't reach for it, because the sound filling the room was something she didn't want to miss for even a single beat. It vibrated again. The technician smiled and said the baby's father must be getting impatient. Delaney smiled too. She thought that was exactly like him. He was always impatient where she was concerned. He could ask her 3 times in a single morning whether she had eaten. By the time she had dressed again, taken the paper for her next appointment, walked through the hallway, and pushed open the door to the parking lot, there were 3 missed calls on her screen. None of them was from Elias. All 3 had come from the diner's landline. Delaney stood in the middle of the parking lot with the appointment slip still in her hand and called back. Marlene Boyd answered, and Marlene managed to say only Delaney's name before falling silent. And in that silence, Delaney understood everything before anyone had the chance to tell her a single word. She drove from the clinic back to the harbor town. The road wasn't long, but afterward she couldn't remember how she had traveled it. Couldn't remember which lights she had stopped at, only the feel of both hands gripping the steering wheel, and the thought repeating over and over in her mind that he was healthy, that he was only 31, that he could lift a 110-pound sack of flour onto his shoulder without losing his breath, that this couldn't possibly be real. When she arrived, an ambulance was already parked on the road in front of the diner, its rear doors standing open, and no one was hurrying anymore. They told her he had collapsed during the breakfast shift, right in front of the large stove, that a major blood vessel inside his chest had ruptured, that it had happened very quickly, and he had almost certainly known nothing of it. They said many other things to her, but she didn't hear a single word. He was already gone before she reached him. That afternoon, after everyone else had left, after Marlene had closed the diner and gone home because Delaney told her to, Delaney returned alone. She unlocked the door with the same key she used every morning, pushed it open with her shoulder because the bottom hinge was crooked, and stood in the darkness for a long time before turning on the lights. The cast-iron skillet was still sitting on the large stove. The oil inside it hardened into a cloudy film, cold for hours. She shut off the gas valve. She walked out to the dining room and meant to clear the tables that had been left in disarray. And then she stopped. On table number 7, the table in the farthest corner with its back to the wall, a plate of eggs had been set neatly in the center. Fried eggs with the yolks still a little soft, now completely cold, but untouched. There was no knife beside the plate and no fork. The chair across from it had been pulled out and never pushed back into place. Delaney stood staring at that plate, and she didn't understand. Thursday breakfast shifts were always crowded, and there was no reason for a plate of food to have been carried out and left untouched. She thought about asking Marlene, and then she didn't. She carried the plate into the kitchen, washed it, turned it upside down on the drying rack, and buried that question somewhere inside herself for the next 6 years. 4 months after that afternoon, Juniper Quinn was born, and Delaney named her after the wild juniper growing behind the old warehouse, the kind of tree no one had planted, no one watered, yet it remained standing through one season after another. From her first week of life, everyone called her June. 3 years later, after a long illness in the middle of winter, June came home, and her world became far quieter than everyone else's. The doctor explained it to Delaney in long, complicated words. But the only thing she truly understood was that her daughter would grow up in a world with fewer sounds, and that she would have to learn another way to speak to her child. She learned from a telephone propped against the sugar jar on the counter in the evenings after closing, while both her hands were submerged in the sink. She would watch part of a lesson, turn off the water, dry her hands, copy the movement, and then turn the water on again. June sat beside her in a high chair with her legs swinging, and she learned much faster than her mother, so quickly that within a few months she had begun correcting Delaney's hands, frowning as she took hold of her mother's fingers and bent them into the proper position, looking stern in exactly the way a tiny teacher might. It was June who invented the game the two of them later called the voice game. She would place her palm against her mother's throat, pressing it close beneath her chin, then sign for her to sing. Delaney would sing. June couldn't hear the melody, but she could feel the rhythm vibrating beneath her palm, and she knew perfectly well when her mother was singing steadily and when she had gone off tune. So Delaney began to sing badly on purpose. She would stretch one word out for far too long and then cut it off abruptly, or make her voice tremble like a broken machine. And June would laugh until she folded backward, then tap her fingers against her mother's throat to signal, "Wrong, wrong, do it again." Some evenings they played until the dishes in the sink remained untouched, and Delaney had to finish washing them close to midnight. She didn't mind. Inside the diner, the thing Delaney preserved most faithfully from Elias wasn't one of his recipes, but the wall behind the counter. When the diner first opened, he had mounted a corkboard there and placed a stack of small yellow slips beside the cash register with a pen. Anyone who finished a meal and happened to have a little extra money that day could pay for another plate, write it on one of the slips, and pin it to the wall with their own hand. Anyone who walked in with nothing in their pocket that day could take down a slip, hand it to the person behind the counter, and sit down to eat like everyone else. They didn't have to explain their circumstances. They didn't have to thank anyone, and no one was allowed to watch them afterward. Elias had made only one rule, that the person behind the counter wasn't allowed to ask any questions at all, not even their name. 6 years after his death, that wall was still in the same place. Some months it grew so thick that the slips overlapped in 3 layers, usually in summer, when the boats came home often and everyone felt generous. Other months it was completely bare, usually in February and March, when the entire town was tightening its belt and there were more people in need than people with something to spare. During those months, Delaney would quietly remain after closing, write several slips in her own hand, pin them to the wall, and tell no one. She changed her handwriting each time, sometimes slanting the letters, sometimes writing in capitals, so no one would realize they had all come from the same person. Marlene knew, and Marlene never once mentioned it. In the highest corner of the wall, close to the ceiling, there was one slip that had faded to the color of ivory, its edges curled from the heat of the kitchen, the writing dark and slightly unsteady, like the hand of someone unaccustomed to holding a pen. It had been there for a very long time, and no one had ever taken it down. Delaney still believed it had been left by some customer from years ago, and the words Elias had carved into the wooden sign above the door, the words he said someone would need to read on exactly the right morning of their life, were only these: "No one has to eat alone." The man had begun coming in on a Tuesday morning 3 years earlier, and the first time, he didn't sit at table number 7. He took the 4th stool at the counter, ordered black coffee and a slice of toast, paid in cash, left the change, and walked out. The following week he came again, on a Tuesday, to the same seat, and ordered the same things. Delaney didn't ask his name. On perhaps the 4th or 5th visit, when she set his plate down, he told her she could call him Mac. She nodded and said, "I'm Delaney," and for a long while, that was everything the two of them knew about each other. He sat at the counter that way through the rest of autumn and all of winter, while the table in the corner remained empty. The night of the snowstorm was the first night anything changed. The town lost power shortly after dusk. The snow fell so heavily that the plows couldn't keep up, and Delaney closed earlier than usual. She was turning over the last stack of clean plates when the front door flew open. The bell gave one lonely ring, and Mac stepped inside with a rush of bitter wind. His left hand was wrapped in a cloth, and the cloth was soaked red across the palm. He stood in the doorway and said, "Sorry, I saw the light was still on." Delaney didn't ask what had happened to him. She didn't ask why he hadn't gone to a hospital, and she didn't ask whether there was anyone she should call. She simply walked around the counter, locked the door again, pulled down the curtain, and told him to sit on the stool beside the counter beneath the battery-powered emergency light. She brought out the first aid kit from the kitchen, the kind anyone who had spent years working around stoves and knives knew they needed, removed the cloth, cleaned the wound, and wrapped it in neat, even layers with the practiced hands of someone who had bandaged herself many times before. While she worked, he didn't look down at his hand. He looked around the darkened diner, at the wall covered in yellow slips, at the rows of empty chairs, then asked in the voice of a man asking merely to fill the silence, "Is that table in the corner always empty?" Delaney tied the final knot and said, "Yes, for some reason, no one ever sits there." He didn't say anything else. She reheated a bowl of soup left over from the afternoon shift, placed it in front of him, and stood on the other side of the counter, finishing her own cold coffee. When he left, he placed more money than usual on the counter, and she didn't follow him outside to return it. The second night came in another autumn. It was close to 10 o'clock. The diner was nearly empty, and Mac was sitting at the counter when his telephone began to vibrate. He answered it and said nothing for a long while, only murmured yes once before ending the call. After that, he didn't get up. He remained there with both hands resting on the counter, staring at some point on the wall in front of him where there was nothing at all. Delaney finished wiping the tables, closed out the register, turned off some of the lights, and didn't tell him the diner was closed. She poured him another cup of coffee. When it went cold, she poured a fresh one. When that went cold too, she poured another. She couldn't remember how many times she did it. She only remembered that at some point she pulled over the stool on the opposite side of the counter and sat facing him, both hands wrapped around her own cup, and she didn't ask a single question. She didn't ask who had called. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't ask whether he was all right, because she already knew the answer was no, and asking a man like him that question would only force him to lie. They sat together in silence through the entire night, while outside the darkness slowly faded into a dim gray. It wasn't until she stood to light the stove, until the smell of fresh coffee began to spread through the diner, until she placed in front of him a plate of fried eggs with the yolks still a little soft, something he had never ordered before, that she spoke for the first time in many hours. She said, "Today you don't have to eat alone." She said it plainly, her voice still rough from a sleepless night, then turned away to unlock the front door for the beginning of a new day. She had no idea that she had just repeated, word for word, the sentence her husband had once spoken to that very same man, in that very same place, on the final morning of his life. Delaney didn't see Mac's face then. She only knew that the following Tuesday, when he walked in, he didn't sit at the counter. He went straight to the farthest corner and sat down at table number 7. The following summer, on a Tuesday morning, 2 unfamiliar men pushed open the door of the Copper Spoon. They weren't from the area, they weren't fishermen, and they spoke louder than necessary from the moment they stepped through the entrance. They sat at a table in the middle of the diner, propped their feet on the chair beside them, ordered by snapping their fingers, and when Delaney brought out the coffee, one of them made a remark about her, not loudly, but without troubling to lower his voice either, the kind of thing men said to each other when they believed the woman standing there was merely part of the establishment. The other man laughed. Delaney set the coffee pot on the table, said nothing, and turned away. She had been hearing remarks like that since she was 19, and waiting tables through the night, and she had learned that answering only wasted her own time. In the corner of the diner, at table number 7, Mac didn't stand up. He didn't turn his head. He kept holding the newspaper in one hand as though he were reading, while the other rested on the tabletop and tapped 3 times, slowly, evenly, making almost no sound. Delaney was walking toward the kitchen when she heard it, and she remembered thinking it was merely the idle habit of a man who had been sitting in one place too long. Less than 2 minutes later, the front door opened. The man who ran the gas station across the road walked in, still wearing his work clothes, with oil on his hands. He went straight to the table in the middle of the diner, didn't look at Delaney, didn't look toward the far corner, and placed a car key on the table in front of the 2 men. Then he stood there with his arms at his sides and didn't say a word. Delaney watched from the kitchen doorway. She saw both men lower their eyes to the key, and she saw their expressions change, not suddenly, but gradually, as though it took them several seconds to understand what was lying on the table. The key ring attached to it meant nothing to Delaney, only a small piece of metal, but it clearly meant something to those 2 men. One of them reached out as though to pick it up, then pulled his hand back, and Delaney saw his fingers trembling. They stood. They took out their wallets and placed money on the table, far more than the bill required. The man who had made the remark turned toward Delaney, lowered his head, and apologized to her in the voice of someone trying to speak with perfect clarity, so there could be no doubt that he had been heard. Then both men walked to the door. Neither of them looked back even once. The gas station owner picked up the key, slipped it into his pocket, nodded to Delaney, and walked back across the road to his work as though nothing had happened. Inside the diner, the nurse coming off her night shift kept eating with her head down, and Beatrice Kovac turned to the next page of the newspaper without looking up. Delaney walked over to table number 7, stood there for a moment, and asked what had just happened. Mac didn't lift his eyes from the paper. He said they had probably remembered an appointment. Delaney looked at him for one more second, then carried the coffee pot to refill the table beside him. The truth was, she had known for a long time that this man wasn't ordinary. She had simply never looked up his name. That spring, people began talking about the new bridge. It would stretch across the river mouth east of town and funnel all the traffic from the highway down to the very intersection in front of the Copper Spoon, And from the moment the planning map was posted on the bulletin board at City Hall, the land beneath Delaney's diner was no longer merely the site of an old warehouse. The first person to arrive was a very young man in a dark blue suit, his shoes spotless in a town where everyone wore boots. He sat down at the counter in the middle of the afternoon, ordered a glass of water, then placed a folder on the wooden surface between the toothpick holder and the bottle of ketchup. He said the corporation believed the figure was very generous, considering the condition of the building. Delaney wiped her hands on her apron, opened the folder, read the number on the first line, then closed it and pushed it back toward him. She said, "The condition of this building is that my husband reinforced the eastern support beam with square steel tubing, using his own hands, and the condition of this land is that he fell less than 4 steps from where I'm standing now." The young man nodded, said he understood, and left his business card. The following week, a certified letter arrived. The figure increased, along with a line reminding her that the offer would remain valid for only a limited time. Delaney read it, folded it, and placed it in the drawer beneath the cash register with the unpaid bills. She didn't answer the letter. Roderick Halstead came in person on a rainy Thursday afternoon, when only 3 or 4 customers remained scattered around the diner. He entered without an umbrella, his gray suit untouched by a single drop because his car had pulled up directly beside the porch, sat down at the counter, and ordered a cup of coffee. Delaney poured it for him. He didn't touch it once during the entire visit. He sat there with both hands resting on the counter and looked around the diner with the eyes of a man calculating which things could be sold and which things would cost money to haul away. His gaze stopped on the wall behind her, on the overlapping layers of yellow slips pinned there. He asked what it was. Delaney said it was the customer's business. Halstead studied it a little longer, then said he had already had people look into the matter, and he had discovered that every month a certain number of meals were given away without bringing in a single dollar, and that number was far greater than the amount customers left on the wall. He said, "You're feeding half this town with money that doesn't belong to you, Miss Quinn. That isn't kindness. It's poor financial management." Delaney set down the coffee pot. She looked directly at him and asked whether he had ever been hungry. Halstead raised one eyebrow slightly. She said, "I mean truly hungry. The kind of hungry where you have to stand outside the door of a place and calculate whether people will look at you if you walk in." He didn't answer. He adjusted his cufflinks and didn't answer. And in that silence, Delaney found the answer she needed. She said, "Then you have no right to put a price on that wall." Halstead remained seated for a while longer. Then he stood, took out his wallet, and placed a bill on the counter worth many times the price of a cup of coffee, setting it down in a way that made it clear this wasn't generosity, but a statement. He told her to keep the change, then walked out into the rain and climbed into his car. He never returned to the diner again. From that day forward, everything came through paperwork. Delaney told no one about it. She didn't tell Marlene, even though Marlene stood less than 5 feet away from her in the kitchen every day. She didn't tell Beatrice Kovac, who sat at table number 4 and had more than enough ways to learn everything happening in town whenever she chose. And she didn't tell the man who still sat at table number 7 every Tuesday morning, the man whose coffee she had poured for 3 years without ever asking his full name, because a child who once had to pack her entire life into a single bag would grow into an adult who didn't know how to ask anyone for anything. She only knew how to manage on her own until managing was no longer possible. The paper trail began with a middle-aged man named Dwight Purcell, the county building inspector, who arrived on a Wednesday morning with a clipboard tucked beneath his arm. He walked around the diner for about 15 minutes, tapped on several places, took a few photographs, and lingered longest at the eastern wall. Delaney watched him from the kitchen. She knew that beam well. She remembered Elias spending an entire month's wages on the square steel tubing he used to reinforce it. Remembered him lying on his back beneath the floor for 3 evenings in a row to fasten the bolts. Remembered him saying that this roof would still be standing after he was dead. Purcell wrote in his report that the eastern support structure showed signs of severe deterioration and that the building presented a potential risk of collapse. He didn't look her in the eye when he handed her the copy. 10 days later, the county issued an emergency demolition order, the kind used only for buildings in danger of falling onto people in the street, and Delaney was given 30 days to file an appeal. Over the next 3 weeks, she received another health code violation for the refrigerator that had passed every inspection for years. Her hearing was postponed twice, and her food supplier called to say she would have to begin paying in advance before any deliveries were made. Then, one afternoon, the manager of the truck stop on the highway called her. his voice embarrassed, and said they were reducing staff and wouldn't need anyone for the night shift for the time being. He apologized 3 times in a call that lasted less than a minute. Delaney thanked him and hung up, then stood holding the telephone for a long time, because that night shift was the money she had always set aside for her daughter. That evening, June came running from the back room the moment Delaney opened the door, her hair still wet from her bath, her face glowing, and she didn't wait for her mother to take off her coat. She raised both hands and made a sequence of signs she had just learned at school, moving quickly and with great pride. Delaney set down her bag, crouched until she was level with her daughter, and told her she didn't understand yet, so she should do it again more slowly. June repeated it at a gentler pace, then took her mother's hands and bent them into the proper shapes, stern as a tiny teacher. Delaney did it wrong once, then deliberately did it wrong again, and June laughed so hard that she fell backward onto the rug. Mother and daughter sat on the kitchen floor repeating the sign over and over until June yawned for the 3rd time. Delaney carried her to bed, pulled the blanket over her, and remained seated on the edge of the mattress until the child's breathing became slow and even. Only then did she return to the kitchen table, switch on the small lamp, and take the stack of papers from her bag. She divided them into 2 piles. The pile on the left held everything that had to be paid that month. The pile on the right held everything that could be postponed. The pile on the right was much thinner than she had hoped. At the very bottom was the letter from the hospital, reminding her about the deposit for June's surgery, with a deadline printed in bold. She sat before those 2 piles until nearly midnight, adding the figures again and again with a pencil, and no matter how she arranged them, the number refused to change. The following morning, she drove to the next town, where no one knew her face, and parked in front of a pawn shop. She sat in the car for a long time. She got out, walked to the glass door, then returned to the car. She did that 3 times. At last, she went inside, placed her wedding ring on the glass counter, and the man behind it lifted the ring beneath a lamp, examined it, named a price, then asked whether she was certain. She said she was. He counted out the money, handed her a receipt, and told her she had 3 months to redeem it if she changed her mind. Delaney returned to the car, closed the door, fastened her seatbelt out of habit, and placed both hands on the steering wheel. Then she folded forward and cried. She cried like someone who had held it in for far too long, without making a sound, her shoulders trembling inside a parked car in the empty lot of a town where no one knew her, and it was the first time she had cried since the afternoon she washed the plate of eggs from table number 7. She cried for about 10 minutes. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve, blew her nose, started the engine, and drove home. The next morning, at 4:45, she slipped the key into the front door lock and pushed the door open with her shoulder. The only lawyer in town willing to take Delaney's case was an old man whose office sat above the drugstore, furnished with desks and chairs inherited from his father's time, and he accepted because she offered to pay him a little each month, with permission to postpone it whenever business at the diner was slow. He usually called around noon, speaking in his slow, measured voice, and he always began by asking how the diner was doing that day. But this call was different. He called before 7 o'clock in the morning, while Delaney was still standing in front of the large stove, and he didn't ask her anything. He told her to find somewhere to sit down and sit. Delaney pulled over the stool at the end of the counter and lowered herself onto it. He said he had just obtained the complete abstract for the property, the truly complete one, the kind that traced ownership all the way back to the years when records were still written by hand. And buried inside it was something no one had seen in all these years. An old mortgage recorded when the entire row along the harbor was still made up of workshops and warehouses, a mortgage that had never been satisfied and had never been removed from the record. The mortgage holder wasn't a bank. It was a family business, a boatyard that had closed and dissolved so long ago that almost no one in town even remembered its name. Delaney asked what that meant. The lawyer was silent for a moment, then said it meant that when Elias bought the warehouse at the county tax auction, he had bought it legally, paid the full amount, and received valid title. But a tax auction could erase only tax debts. It didn't automatically erase everything else. And that old mortgage had simply remained there, unnoticed and unchecked, because at the time, the land was worth almost nothing, and no one had bothered to investigate something nobody wanted to buy. He went on to explain that, legally, the rightful heir to the dissolved boatyard still possessed a claim, and if that person filed a lawsuit seeking enforcement of the old mortgage, it would become a long, complicated, expensive case, but a completely lawful one. No forged document would be necessary, No inspector's signature would be necessary. All they would have to do was file the claim and wait. Delaney sat motionless on the stool, the cleaning cloth still clenched in her hand, and asked the only question she could think of. So he was right? The lawyer said no. He told her to listen carefully, because this was the part that had kept him awake all night. They already had a door standing wide open, a clean legal path that would take longer but couldn't be challenged, and yet they hadn't walked through that door. They had hired a bulldozer. They had bought an inspector's signature and an emergency order, which meant they had accepted the risk of going to prison to accomplish something that should have required nothing more than filing a claim. "No one in this world does that, Miss Quinn," he said. "Not unless there is something behind that door they don't want to step through." Delaney asked whether he knew who the heir to the boatyard was. The lawyer said the dissolution records were extremely old, and while he had the name of the final owner, he needed more time to trace the surviving heir, but he would find them. Then, before ending the call, he gave her one instruction. Until he called again, she wasn't to sign anything. Delaney placed the telephone on the counter. Beyond the windows, the fog over the harbor was beginning to lift, and the old fishing boats lay tilted in the mudflats exactly as they had for years. She stared out at them, and only one question remained in her mind, the question the lawyer had laid before her, and no one could answer. Why had he chosen to tear down the wall? Beatrice Kovac had been sitting at table number 4 long enough to recognize when a woman was counting her loose change more often than usual. That evening, she lingered after everyone else had gone, pretending to finish the final page of her newspaper, and she watched Delaney empty a tin box onto the counter, smooth each small bill flat, and sort the money into stacks by denomination. When she was finished, Delaney drew out one small bundle, secured it with a rubber band, and slipped it into a worn envelope bearing a handwritten label with 2 words on it. Yellow slips. Miss Kovac didn't ask a thing. She simply went home, and the following morning she went to the county administration building and filled out a request for copies of public records under the Freedom of Information law, the sort of form she had completed thousands of times over the course of her career in journalism. She spent 3 nights with that stack of records spread across her kitchen table. On the first night, she searched the license number of the structural engineer, whose name appeared beneath the assessment, and she found him in the State Licensing Board's records, along with a note stating that he had surrendered his license and stopped practicing many years earlier before moving to a southern state. A man who had surrendered his license couldn't sign a structural assessment, and the signature sitting plainly beneath that final page belonged to someone who, in the eyes of the law, no longer existed. On the second night, she obtained the warehouse's original blueprints from the town archives, laid them beside the report, and checked every figure. The measurements recorded in the inspection didn't match anything on the plans, not even the actual length of the eastern wall she had walked past every morning for years. The third night was the one she sat up the longest. She requested 2 additional county demolition files from the previous several years, both involving old buildings standing on corners where major roads were later routed, and she placed all 3 sets of documents side by side beneath her desk lamp. The passages describing the structural damage in all 3 reports were nearly identical, word for word, with only the street names and the direction of the walls changed. Both of the other properties, once the buildings had been demolished, had been transferred to the same company. Miss Kovac closed the file, sat motionless in her kitchen for a long while, then looked up at the calendar on the wall and calculated. The courthouse would open on Monday morning. The demolition order would take effect at the beginning of the week. The following morning, she drove to Providence. She didn't call ahead, didn't make an appointment, and didn't need one, because she had known for a long time exactly whom she was going to see. There had once been a time when she intended to write an article about that man and the name his family carried, and she had made it halfway through the investigation before deciding to close her notebook and write nothing at all. She waited for about 40 minutes, in a room whose windows overlooked the old harbor. When Cormac Sheridan entered, she didn't stand. She pushed the file across the table toward him and said, "I haven't come here to ask you to break anyone's legs, Mr. Sheridan." He sat down across from her without touching the papers. She continued, "I came because you're the only man in this entire state who can accomplish 3 things before 9 o'clock on Monday morning, and that is all the time I have." Cormac opened the file, read the first page, then turned to the next. He read slowly, overlooking nothing, and neither of them spoke throughout. When he reached the final page, he paused a little longer. Then he closed the file, rested his palm on its cover, and asked Miss Kovac why she had chosen to come to him. The old woman sat straight-backed in her chair and said it was because she had eaten breakfast at that diner for 11 years, and because she knew exactly which table he sat at. Cormac looked out the window. He said, "On the day my father was released from prison, not a single restaurant in this city would accept a reservation for him. Not one. Except for one place." He turned back to look at her. "People don't forget things like that, Miss Kovac." News traveled quickly in places where people didn't put it down on paper. And by that evening, someone among the men who worked for Cormac Sheridan had already heard what had happened. Rafferty Nolan was only 24, and at that age, anger almost always arrived before thought. He heard about a widow selling her wedding ring at a pawnshop, heard about a signature belonging to a man who had surrendered his license, and he couldn't sleep. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he took his car, and in the trunk was a can of gasoline he had bought at the station beside the highway. The company's equipment yard stood at the end of a dirt road north of town, bordered on both sides by fields of reeds, with no lights and no houses nearby. Rafferty turned onto that road and had driven about half a mile when his headlights swept across the figure of a man standing in the middle of it. He slammed on the brakes. The car skidded over the gravel, then stopped a few yards away. Cormac Sheridan stood there in a black wool coat, both hands in his pockets, making no signal and not moving at all. He waited until Rafferty switched off the engine before walking around to the driver's side. Rafferty lowered the window and began talking, speaking quickly, saying that Bastard had bought off the entire county, saying that if no one did anything, by Tuesday morning the diner would be nothing but a pile of bricks. Cormac let him finish. Then he asked what Rafferty intended to do. Rafferty said he intended to make sure none of those machines would ever run again. Cormac nodded slowly, as though he were genuinely considering the idea. Then he said, "Listen to me. You burn one bulldozer tonight, and tomorrow morning there won't be a single line in the newspaper about a forged signature. There will be only one story: that a group of men destroyed property during a land dispute involving a woman raising a young child. From that moment on, she won't be the victim anymore. She'll become the woman whose friends go around burning other people's property. She'll lose the diner, she'll lose her name in this town, and the reason will be you." Rafferty sat motionless, both hands still clenched around the steering wheel. Cormac continued, his voice as low and even as if he were discussing the weather. "So answer this for yourself. Do you want to help her, or do you want to see yourself as a brave man?" Rafferty couldn't answer. Cormac opened the trunk, lifted out the gasoline can, carried it to the drainage ditch beside the road, and poured it all away, slowly, until the final drop was gone. Then he returned, took the keys to his own car from his pocket, and passed them through the open window. He said, "Leave your car here. Someone will collect it in the morning. Drive mine home and get some sleep. Tomorrow, you'll have real work to do." At that same hour, several miles away, inside the diner where every light had been turned off except one behind the counter, Delaney was standing before the wall of yellow slips. One note on the outermost layer had come loose from its pin and torn in half when someone's coat accidentally brushed against it. She picked up both pieces, laid them on the counter, smoothed them flat with the edge of her hand, then joined them again with a strip of clear tape. The handwriting belonged to a fisherman who had died several seasons earlier, a man who used to pin 3 or 4 slips to the wall at once whenever his boat came home heavy with fish. She pinned it back in exactly the same place, without shifting it even slightly, then stood looking at it for a while, before turning off the final light. That Tuesday morning, Mac sat at table number 7, as he always did, and after Delaney finished pouring his coffee, he asked her to sit down for a moment. He said he could buy the property outright, pay a fair price, settle the old mortgage as well, and transfer the entire title into her name. It could all be completed within a few days. After that, no one would be able to touch it. Delaney listened to everything with both hands resting in her lap. Then she shook her head. She said, "If you buy it for me, then it belongs to you, no matter whose name appears on the papers. And I become a woman who owes another man something. I spent my whole childhood living in houses where people allowed me to stay, Mac. I know what that feels like." She stood and picked up the coffee pot. "I don't need anyone to save me. I need my wall to remain standing exactly where it is." Cormac didn't argue. He only gave a single nod and finished his coffee. If Delaney wouldn't allow him to buy the property, then Cormac Sheridan would buy something else. Meridian Crossing had taken out a bridge loan to carry several projects along the highway at the same time, and that loan was held by a private credit fund in Boston. Desmond Hale needed 2 days to find it and 1 afternoon to make the first approach. At first, The people across the table seemed more than willing. Then, around noon the following day, the fund called back and said they had changed their minds and intended to keep the loan. That same day, Halstead's attorney filed a notice asserting a right of first refusal, the kind of document people prepared only when they already knew someone was coming. Desmond placed the copy on the table and said simply, "There's someone inside our own house." Cormac didn't summon anyone for questioning. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten anyone, and didn't have anyone followed. He did only one very simple thing. He called 3 people into his office separately during 3 different hours that afternoon, told each of them the price he intended to offer for the loan, and gave each person a different figure. Then he went home and slept. The following morning, the proposal Meridian submitted to the credit fund in an attempt to block the transaction contained one figure. It was the figure he had given the second man. The second man was a financial advisor who had served Cormac's family since his father was alive. A silver-haired man, careful in everything he did, who hadn't arrived late to a single meeting in all those years. He was called into the office close to noon. He didn't deny it. He sat down, removed his glasses and cleaned them, then said he had fallen into debt because of a private matter he didn't wish to discuss. Cormac listened to everything, then said, "You're finished as of tomorrow morning." The man nodded. Cormac continued, "Don't use my name anywhere again, and don't wait for anyone to come looking for you. No one is coming." The silver-haired man looked up, and in his eyes was the disbelief of someone who couldn't comprehend what he had just heard. Cormac rose, fastened the button of his coat, and gave him one final sentence. "You should understand that I'm sparing you not because I'm kind. I'm sparing you because this week I'm trying to become the kind of man who can sit down for breakfast in that diner without feeling ashamed." The next 11 hours unfolded in 2 rooms, one in Providence and one in Boston, with telephone calls following one another without pause. The credit fund demanded another condition, then another after that. Near dawn, they signed. The heart of the transaction wasn't the money, though the sum was hardly small. The heart of it lay on the final page of the original loan agreement, where Roderick Halstead had signed a clause personally guaranteeing the debt with his own assets, something he had agreed to back when he still believed he could never lose. From the moment the assignment took effect, the signature was no longer held by a fund in Boston. That afternoon, inside his office on the highest floor of the Meridian building, Halstead called the credit fund, and no one answered. He called a second time, then a third. On the 4th attempt, an assistant finally answered and told him the loan had been assigned, and the buyer wasn't yet prepared to disclose their identity. Halstead set down the telephone, stood, walked to the window, then returned to his desk and opened his calendar. He looked at the date the construction crew was scheduled to enter the property. Then he picked up the telephone and called Dwight Purcell. Several miles away, in the kitchen behind the diner, Delaney sat down at the table to rest her feet for a moment after finishing the floor. She lowered her head onto her folded arms and fell asleep. When she startled awake, her heart pounding because she thought she had slept through opening time, the clock on the wall showed only 3 o'clock in the morning. She sat upright, rubbed her eyes, and realized she had slept for barely 20 minutes. There wasn't enough time to go home and sleep again. So she remained there in the darkened kitchen, both hands wrapped around an empty cup, waiting until 4:45. The detail that made Delaney realize the truth was a very small one. In the file her lawyer sent back to her was a copy of 1 page from the diner's books, a copy Meridian had submitted as evidence that the business was losing money. She stared at that page for a very long time. It wasn't an image from a scanner. It was a photograph taken with a telephone, tilted slightly to one side, and in the lower right corner, caught within the frame, was a small piece of blue and white checked fabric. There was only one blue and white checked apron in the entire diner. Delaney sat motionless in the kitchen for a long while with that sheet of paper in her hand. She didn't break anything, and she didn't call anyone. She waited until evening, when all the customers had gone and the doors were locked, then placed the page on the counter in front of Marlene Boyd. The 52-year-old woman looked down, and she didn't need more than a few seconds. She didn't deny a single thing. She said, "Yes, it was me." Delaney asked how much. Marlene named a figure, then added that she had received half in advance and would receive the other half after turning over copies of the remaining property documents. Delaney asked why. And that woman, the woman who had worked in this kitchen since Elias was still alive, the woman who had answered the telephone that morning and called Delaney 3 times in a row, the The woman who had stayed beside her washing dishes through the first winter after the funeral without accepting a single dollar in wages, began to cry. She said her son was in a rehabilitation center out of state and had been there for nearly a year, and that the place sent a bill every month. She said she had sold her car, mortgaged her house, and that the previous month they had called to say that unless she found a way to pay, they would have to remove the boy from the program. She said, "I know I was wrong. I knew it from the moment I took that envelope." Delaney stood on the other side of the counter, with both hands resting on the wood, and she didn't raise her voice. She asked only one question: "Why didn't you tell me?" Marlene wiped her face with the back of her hand and gave a twisted, broken smile. She said, "Because you would have given it to me. You would have given me everything you had. And what do you have, child? You're selling your wedding ring to pay for that little girl's surgery. Do you think I didn't know?" The only sound left in the kitchen was the steady hum of the refrigerator. Marlene reached behind her back, untied the checked apron, folded it into 4 neat sections, and placed it on the counter. She said, "I'm sorry," then turned toward the back door. She had taken 3 steps when Delaney called after her, "Auntie." Marlene stopped, but didn't turn around. Delaney picked up the apron, walked around the end of the counter, went to her, and held it out. She said, "You forgot this." The woman looked at the folded apron in Delaney's hand, then looked up at her face, and didn't understand. Delaney placed it in her hands. She said, "Tomorrow at 4:45, and come 10 minutes early. Yesterday's bread burned around the edges, so I think the oven temperature is uneven." Marlene stood there, holding the apron folded into 4, and she couldn't walk any farther. She remained in the middle of that kitchen and began to sob aloud, while Delaney turned away and picked up a cloth to finish wiping the stove, because she knew there were times when a person needed to cry without anyone watching. The story reached the other side of town within a day. Rafferty, Nolan, and 2 other men were already sitting in a car, intending to go have a serious conversation with the woman who had taken the envelope. Cormac Sheridan stopped them just outside the yard. He didn't shout. He asked Rafferty what he intended to do, and when the young man told him, Cormac asked only one question in return. "She is 52 years old. Are you planning to stand in Delaney's kitchen and threaten a 52-year-old woman?" Rafferty said she had betrayed Delaney. Cormac said, "I know." Then he said the words that made all 3 men stand still. "Anyone who touches a person who has ever walked through the door of that diner is touching me. No exceptions. Is that clear?" Rafferty nodded. Cormac turned and went back inside, and it wasn't until that evening that Desmond Hale learned the entire bill at the rehabilitation center out of state had been paid in full, with no name attached to the payment and not a single message left behind. Roderick Halstead descended into the underground parking garage beneath the Meridian building after nightfall, carrying his briefcase and still calculating whom he needed to call the following morning. His car was parked in a reserved space, bearing his name beside a concrete pillar. And as he approached it, he saw a man leaning against that pillar. There was no one else in the garage. No footsteps sounded behind him. Halstead stopped and asked who he was. Cormac Sheridan didn't answer that question. He straightened away from the pillar, both hands still in the pockets of his coat, and began speaking in the even voice of a man reciting a list he had already memorized. He said that every Tuesday evening Halstead ate at the Italian restaurant on Main Street, at the second table beside the window when counted from the entrance, and that he always left before 9 o'clock. He said the car Halstead was driving wasn't registered in his own name, but belonged to a subsidiary he had created to lease equipment, and that the company hadn't leased a single machine in 2 years. He said the bridge loan Halstead had signed in the spring contained a clause on its final page, a personal asset guarantee, and that he had signed it in blue ink. Halstead remained still. The briefcase in his hand sagged slightly lower. Cormac said, "I'm not telling you those 3 things to frighten you. I'm telling you so you'll understand that I know exactly what I'm capable of touching. Now I'll tell you the 4th thing. I won't touch any of those 3. Not one of them." He paused for a moment, then continued. "I'm going to take your company, with paperwork, notarized, dated, witnessed, and lawful, down to the final period. And you'll have to spend the rest of your life knowing what it feels like to have something taken from you properly, something you've never done for anyone in all these years." Halstead studied him for a while. Then he gave a short, dry scoff, the laugh of a man who had sat in too many boardrooms and heard too many people stand up to deliver grand declarations before sitting back down and accomplishing nothing. He said, "I don't know who you are, and I don't care. I've met a dozen men like you. They all come at night, they all speak quietly, and they all know a few things about me. By next week, I'll have forgotten your name." Cormac nodded as though that were an entirely reasonable answer. He walked past Halstead toward the exit, and as he passed him, he stopped for exactly 1 second. He said, "Mr. Halstead, you had a door already standing open in that property record. Clean, legal, slower, but impossible to challenge. And yet you went out and hired a bulldozer." Halstead spun around. For the first time during their encounter, something changed across his face, swiftly, then vanished just as fast. Cormac didn't ask another question. He simply watched the reaction, recorded it in his mind, then walked straight toward the ramp and never looked back. Halstead remained alone in the underground garage, still carrying his briefcase, long after the sound of those footsteps had disappeared completely. Beatrice Kovac left town close to 10 o'clock on Saturday night, carrying the file in a cloth bag on the passenger seat, and drove for more than an hour inland until she reached a farmhouse with a wooden fence and a porch light that remained on throughout the night. The woman who opened the door had retired from the bench several seasons earlier, her hair tied neatly back and a thick sweater wrapped around her, and she showed no surprise at finding Kovac standing there at such an hour. The two women sat at the kitchen table beneath a desk lamp, and the retired judge read every page, overlooking nothing, occasionally stopping to turn back and compare one section with another. She paused longest over the 3 descriptions that matched one another word for word. Then she removed her glasses, sat silently for a moment, and said, "This can't wait until Monday morning." She took out a sheet of paper, wrote an emergency restraining order by hand, read it through once, then signed her name at the bottom. The clock in the hallway struck 1 as she set down her pen. Kovac took the order, thanked her, and drove home through the fog. She had no idea that while she was sitting at that kitchen table, dozens of miles away, everything had already begun moving in another direction. The documents Meridian submitted to the county listed 2 addresses. One was the corner of the Harbor Road, where the Copper Spoon stood, and the other was an empty parcel on the northern edge of town beside the dirt road leading into the reed fields. Throughout the previous week, equipment had been hauled into the northern yard. Bulldozers, excavators, several corrugated metal containers, and anyone passing by could see them. Cormac Sheridan's men had taken turns watching the site since Friday afternoon, 2 men to each shift, their car parked about 330 feet from the gate, with the lights turned off. Saturday night passed quietly. No one came. Nothing moved. Close to 5 o'clock on Sunday morning, one of the 2 men got out of the car to walk around the fence and wake himself up. And he noticed something the darkness had concealed for hours. The orange bulldozer was gone. Fresh tread marks crossed the dirt and led through the rear gate in the opposite direction, toward the fishing harbor road. No one knew when it had been moved. It had gone by the longer route past the docks, a road used at night only by trucks hauling blocks of ice, so no one had paid attention to one more heavy engine. Cormac's telephone vibrated at 4:56. He was already awake and wearing his coat. At roughly the same time, on the other side of town, Delaney slipped the key into the front door lock and pushed the door open with her shoulder as she did every morning. She hadn't yet turned on the lights when she heard the engine. It wasn't a fish truck. It was heavier and slower, with the sound of metal grinding against metal rising from below the hill, the sound of something being dragged on a trailer. She stood motionless in the darkened diner and listened as it came closer. Delaney stepped behind the counter, opened the drawer beneath the cash register, and took out the telephone. In 3 years, she had never called that man even once. She had kept his number since the night of the snowstorm, when he wrote it on the back of a receipt and told her to call if anything ever happened, and she had placed that piece of paper in the drawer and never touched it again. She dialed. The telephone rang exactly once. She managed only one sentence. "Mac, they're here." Then the signal along the harbor faltered as it did on most early mornings, and the call went dead. She tried again, but it wouldn't connect. She set the telephone on the counter and walked toward the door. At the other end, Cormac Sheridan didn't call her back. He didn't call anyone. He went straight down to the parking garage and drove himself, waiting for no one to accompany him. The trip from Providence to Asheville Landing usually took nearly an hour. On Sunday morning, the roads were empty. The fog lay thick along the marshland, and he covered the entire distance in 34 minutes. He turned onto the harbor road, saw the yellow headlights sweeping across the gravel lot in front of the diner, and pulled onto the shoulder about 130 feet away. He switched off the engine, The clock on the dashboard read 5:38. Halstead had made it halfway back to his car when he slowed down. A sound was growing louder, not from behind him, but from both ends of the harbor road at once. He stopped completely, turned toward the east first, then toward the west. From both directions, 2 lines of black vehicles came creeping forward, moving slowly and steadily, none passing another, none sounding its horn. They stopped a few dozen yards from the gravel lot, one vehicle behind the next, blocking the road completely in both directions, and not a single one turned off its headlights. The drivers didn't get out. Every door remained closed. There was only the sound of engines idling more softly and then shutting down, one by one, until the road became so quiet that the water could be heard striking the pilings below the hill. The bulldozer operator had switched off his engine at some point without anyone telling him to. But it wasn't those vehicles that drained the color from Roderick Halstead's face. In the faint gray light, barely bright enough to make out a person's features, people were walking toward them from behind both lines of cars. At first there were only a few figures, then more than a dozen, then a long procession stretching across the entire road and spilling onto the grass on both sides. Halstead recognized some of them, people he had passed at City Hall without ever troubling to look at them. Fishermen still wearing their rubber boots. A nurse still dressed in her night shift uniform, with a thin coat hastily pulled over it. A retired schoolteacher leaning on a cane, walking slowly, and no one moved ahead of him. The entire crowd kept pace with the slowest person among them. The teenage newspaper carrier walked beside his bicycle, his delivery bag still full. Some women held one another's hands. Some people were still carrying cups of coffee they had hurriedly made at home. No one shouted. No one raised a fist. They simply came forward, formed a broad arc around the gravel lot, and stopped there. And every single one of them, without exception, held a small yellow slip of paper that had faded with age. Some were still smooth and flat. Some were so crumpled they had to be carefully unfolded before the words could be read. Some had been preserved inside notebooks. Others had just been taken from wallets. They didn't hand the slips to anyone. They only held them where they could be seen and stood watching. Delaney was still kneeling in the mud with both arms wrapped around the wooden sign. And when she raised her head and saw that great arc of people, she couldn't understand what she was looking at. She didn't know that at 4:40 that morning, Marlene Boyd had received a telephone call. The caller had said only one thing, that she shouldn't come to work at the diner that day, that she should stay home and consider it a day off. Marlene had set down the telephone and sat motionless on the edge of her bed in the darkness. She was the only person in the entire town who immediately understood what a call like that meant, because she had once accepted their envelope. She didn't put on a coat. She simply reached for the telephone and called Beatrice Kovac shortly before 5 o'clock in the morning. Kovac had been home for only a little more than an hour, and the court order was still lying on her kitchen table. She listened for less than 20 seconds, ended the call, then took out the leather-bound notebook she had used throughout 30 years of reporting in that town, the notebook containing the telephone number of nearly every household in the area. She made the first 5 calls. She told each person she reached to call 5 more, and she gave every one of them exactly the same sentence, without adding a word of explanation. If you have ever taken a slip from the wall at the Copper Spoon, then this morning is the time to bring it back. Within 30 minutes, nearly the entire town was awake. Many of those people had lived for years believing they were the only ones who had ever done such a thing, that they alone had once stood outside a door in the morning and wondered whether they dared to enter. And now they stood beside one another on the harbor road, seeing in the hand of the person next to them a yellow slip exactly like their own. Beatrice Kovac separated herself from the crowd and walked into the middle of the gravel lot with the cloth bag in her hand, heading straight toward Halstead. She took out the handwritten order, its folds still sharply creased, and held it in front of his face, close enough for him to read the signature at the bottom. She said, "This was signed after midnight. Would you like to see the date?" Then she opened the file and began reading aloud in the silence of that road, one item at a time. The license number of the engineer whose signature appeared on the structural assessment. The date that engineer surrendered his license and moved to a southern state. The measurements that didn't match a single line on the original blueprints, still preserved at City Hall. And the 3 passages describing damage to 3 different buildings on 3 different corners, almost identical word for word. When she finished, she closed the file and said, "I've done this work for 30 years, Mr. Halstead. You didn't lose because I'm good at it. You lost because you were lazy. You used the same old form 3 times in a row. The town sheriff's car arrived immediately afterward, its lights revolving but its siren silent. He stepped out, took the order, read it, then walked directly to the bulldozer and told the operator to shut the engine down completely, remove the key, and keep his hands off the controls. He told the construction crew that every piece of equipment was frozen in place, that no one was permitted to remove anything from the site, and that anyone who defied the order would have their name entered into the official record. Then he turned toward Dwight Purcell, who had been standing half hidden behind the cab with his clipboard in his hands, and asked only one question. "Dwight, whose signature is this?" Purcell couldn't answer immediately. All around them, dozens of telephones had been raised, their screens gleaming in the gray morning light. At last, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear that he had never inspected the eastern support beam. He said he had been handed a completed report and told only to sign it. He said this wasn't the first time. He had signed 2 earlier reports in the same way for 2 other properties. He said, "I'm finished. I'm not covering it up anymore," then sat down on the concrete step that remained in front of the diner, still clutching the clipboard against his chest. Desmond Hale approached from the line of vehicles carrying an ivory envelope. He handed it to Halstead, and Halstead accepted it out of reflex. Inside was a notarized copy of an assignment dated Friday evening, transferring every creditor's right under Meridian Crossing's bridge loan, including the personal asset guarantee on the final page, to a buyer whose full name appeared in bold print. Halstead reached that name, and his hand began to tremble slightly. Cormac Sheridan stood several steps away with both hands still in the pockets of his coat. He said, "You woke up this morning believing you owned this corner. The truth is that since Friday night, you haven't even owned the name you signed beneath that contract." The crowd erupted into noise. Someone shouted, then 10 more voices joined in, and Rafferty Nolan was the first to step forward, with dozens of others behind him, townspeople and Cormac's men alike, all closing in on the man in the gray suit who stood alone in the middle of the gravel lot. Halstead stepped backward once and found there was nowhere else to go. Then Delaney Quinn rose from the mud. She was still holding the wooden sign in her arms, her hair plastered against one side of her face, her apron stained from the knees down, and she took several short steps until she stood directly in front of Halstead, her back toward him and her face turned toward the entire crowd. She raised one hand. She didn't shout. She said, "No one touches him." Rafferty stopped less than 7 feet from her. The whole road fell silent. Delaney continued, her voice rough but unmistakably clear. "Not because he deserves it. Because no one has ever been beaten outside the door of this diner. Not once. My husband didn't build this place so that could happen today." No one moved. In the silence, there was only the sound of water striking the pilings below, and the faint flutter of a yellow slip that escaped someone's hand, turned once in the air, and fell into the mud. In that silence, Cormac Sheridan spoke, and he said exactly 3 words. "Pick it up." No one stepped forward. Not a single hand touched Roderick Halstead. No one seized him by the shoulder, and no one shoved him to the ground. The entire harbor road stood motionless like a row of trees. Halstead looked around, at the sheriff standing with his arms folded beside the patrol car, at the arc of people holding yellow slips in their hands, at Delaney still standing between him and the crowd, with her back turned toward him. Then he bent down, and as he did, he saw something he hadn't looked at once until that moment. The eastern wall had collapsed inward and torn away part of the wooden flooring with it, exposing an old concrete surface beneath the shattered boards, gray and scored with parallel grooves running lengthwise, the kind of grooves poured only into a shipyard floor, so the keel of a vessel could be dragged down toward the water. In the nearest corner, pressed into the concrete and nearly worn away, a line of lettering was still visible. The name of a business followed by the words "and Sons." Halstead froze halfway through the motion of bending down. He hadn't bought this property because of the bridge. The bridge was only the reason he had given the board of directors, the bank, and himself. He had come here because of that concrete floor, because of an afternoon many years earlier when, still in his teens, he had stood inside that shipyard after every piece of equipment had been cleared away, and watched his father hand a ring of keys to a man who wouldn't even look the old man in the eye, who merely held out his hand to take them and then lowered his head to record the transaction in a ledger. Halstead had spent more than 10 years making certain he would never again be the man handing over the keys, and he had become the man who received them. Beatrice Kovac was the one who spoke, and she asked the very question the old lawyer had raised, and no one had been able to answer. She said, You had a door already standing open in the records for this property, Mr. Halstead. You're the only surviving heir to that shipyard. All you had to do was file a claim in court and wait. It would have taken longer, but it would have been clean. Why didn't you do that?" Halstead straightened, and for the first time that morning, his voice no longer carried the polished courtesy he had spent years perfecting. He said, "Because if I claimed it through the courts, I would have had to declare that I was his son. I would have had to sit before a judge and speak that name aloud, and I would have had to explain how that shipyard came to an end." He looked down at the gray concrete. "I would rather pay off an inspector." No one said anything more. Halstead bent down, lowered himself onto one knee and then both knees in the soft mud, and took the wooden sign from Delaney when she held it out to him. He drew a handkerchief from the breast pocket of his suit, a handkerchief embroidered in one corner with his initials, and began to wipe. Thick mud clung inside every carved groove. He wiped, folded the cloth, wiped again with a clean side, then kept wiping until the thin fabric tore open against the wooden splinters. He dropped it and continued with the palm of his hand, rubbing the rough wood again and again until his knuckles reddened and mud ran over his wrists, staining the sleeves of his gray suit. One word at a time emerged beneath the pale light of morning. "No one has to eat alone." He stared at those words for a long while. Then he stood, held the sign in both hands, and offered it to Delaney. She received it with both of hers. She didn't snatch it away or knock his hands aside. She pressed it against her chest, and her fingers traced the carved grooves as though checking whether any part of them had been lost. Then she said, "You thought this was only a piece of wood. My husband carved it on a night when there was almost nothing left in our bank account, and that same night he still left a bowl of soup outside for the man sleeping beneath the bridge on the other side of the harbor. A man like him fed strangers with what he himself didn't have, so that a man like you could stand in this lot this morning and call it firewood." 3 days later, after the entire town had learned that name and the newspapers and television stations had repeated it again and again in their reports, Delaney drove to Providence alone. She didn't call ahead. They showed her into a room with windows overlooking the old harbor, and she stood there until Cormac Sheridan walked in. He was about to say something when she spoke first. She said, "Do you think I'm stupid? For 3 years, you never once sat with your back to the door. Not once. For 3 years, you paid in cash. No card, no receipt. For 3 years, not a single unfamiliar car dared park in front of my diner on a Tuesday morning." She said, "I've been waiting tables since I was 19, Mac. I can't read other people's ledgers, but I can read the people sitting inside my diner." Cormac remained silent for a while, then asked why she had never questioned him. Delaney said, "Because I grew up in houses that weren't mine. Everywhere I went, I learned the same thing. Everyone has a part of their life they don't want anyone to touch, and if you touch it, you'll have to leave. I left that part of you alone for 3 years. But that morning, it walked into my parking lot. It stood in the mud outside my home. So now you're going to tell me." Cormac pulled out a chair and sat down, and he told her he had a younger brother, a few years younger than he was, and the boy had died a long time ago. Suddenly, taken by the same thing that had taken Elias, a major blood vessel inside his chest rupturing without the slightest warning. After the funeral, Cormac enrolled in a CPR course at a community center, sitting among housewives and volunteer firefighters, practicing chest compressions on a plastic mannequin, and he studied with the seriousness of a man who believed it was the most important work of his life. He said, "I learned because I wasn't there when my brother needed me." Then he told her about that morning. He had buried his foster father the day before, the man who had taken him in when he was young and taught him nearly everything he knew. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. He drove without a destination and stopped at the small diner by the harbor because the lights inside were on. He sat at the table in the corner with his back against the wall out of habit, and he had no intention of ordering anything. He simply sat there. After a while, the cook came out of the kitchen. He didn't ask whether Cormac was all right, and didn't ask what he needed. He walked to the cash register, wrote something on a yellow slip, pinned it to the wall with his own hand, then brought out a plate of fried eggs with the yolk still a little soft, placed it in front of him, and said one sentence. Then he returned to the kitchen. Less than a minute later, there was the sound of something falling. Cormac said, "I jumped over the counter. I did exactly what they had taught me, at the right rhythm, in the right way. I kept going for a long time, much longer than anyone still had reason to hope. Someone called an ambulance. I knew I couldn't save him. he said, and I washed my hands in the kitchen sink, then left through the back door. Because of the name I carried then, if I had still been standing inside that diner when the ambulance arrived, everything would have become far worse for a pregnant woman who was about to receive that news. So I left. It was the most cowardly thing I've ever done in my life. Delaney stood motionless. Cormac continued. Do you know what you said to me on the night of the snowstorm? He said. You repeated the exact sentence your husband had spoken to me on the final morning of his life. Every word. You didn't know. You only reheated a bowl of soup and said it. He looked down at his hands resting on the table. Then he said the final thing. And you let me sit at that table for 3 months while they were tearing you apart piece by piece. You poured coffee for me every Tuesday morning and didn't say a single word. Delaney drove home. She unlocked the diner, which now had only 3 walls remaining, stood before the wall behind the counter that was still intact, and reached toward the highest corner near the ceiling. She removed the ivory-colored slip. Hidden behind it was another, then another. She counted 6 slips, all written in the same dark, slightly trembling hand, pinned one over another through all those years, one for every year, and no one had ever taken them down. She held the 6 yellow slips in her hands, and at last she understood who the untouched plate of eggs on table number 7 had been meant for that afternoon. Everything that followed happened far more quickly than all the things that had required so much waiting beforehand. Dwight Purcell pleaded guilty, surrendered his inspector's license, and identified the 2 earlier reports he had signed in the same way. Marlene Boyd was the second person to testify. She went to the prosecutor's office on her own, told them about the envelope, admitted her own part in it, and stated clearly who had given it to her and where it had happened, knowing full well that her testimony would place her own name in the official record as well. The following morning, she was still in the kitchen at 4:35, 10 minutes early, exactly as Delaney had told her to be. The board of Meridian Crossing removed Roderick Halstead within a matter of days, and they didn't do it out of any sense of morality. They did it because the new creditor had sent a formal demand that the company replace its chief executive, and a corporation whose creditor held the personal guarantee bearing its chief executive's signature didn't have many choices. Halstead accepted a settlement rather than go to trial, paid compensation to Delaney and to the owners of the other 2 properties, and was barred from working in real estate development anywhere in the state for many years. The bridge was still built, but the restaurant planned for that corner never rose from the ground. In all the news reports that ran throughout that week, not one line mentioned Cormac Sheridan. He gave no interviews, appeared in no photographs, and his name wasn't included anywhere in the case file. As for June, that part had already gone wrong before that Sunday morning ever came. The deadline printed in bold on the hospital letter had passed while Delaney was running from one place to another trying to manage the appeal paperwork, and she hadn't paid the full deposit. The hospital called one afternoon, the voice on the other end polite and slightly regretful, and told her that the surgical slot had been given to another patient on the waiting list. They would place June in the next round, but no one yet knew when that would be. Delaney thanked them and ended the call, then stood in the kitchen for a while before returning to carry plates out to the customers. 3 days later, the hospital called again. This time it was someone else, speaking with an awkward uncertainty, who said there had been a mistake in the records. Juniper Quinn's surgery had never been canceled. The entire cost, including the deposit, had already been paid, and the original surgery date had been preserved. Delaney asked who had paid it. The person read aloud the name listed in the file. It wasn't the name of a person. It was the name of a trust registered in Providence, with no individual named among its representatives, and the money had been transferred into the hospital's account on a day from the week before that. Before the morning, Beatrice Kovac drove to Providence with the file inside her cloth bag, which meant it had nothing to do with the property, nothing to do with the bulldozer, and nothing to do with anything that had happened on that Sunday morning. Delaney sat down on the stool at the end of the counter, and then she remembered. She remembered a Tuesday morning the previous summer, when June ran into the diner after her swimming lesson, went straight to the table in the corner, lifted her hair to show the man sitting there the small device behind her ear, then launched into a long stream of signs that he almost certainly couldn't understand at all. She remembered how he had watched until she finished, nodded in all the right places, then asked Delaney only one question, whether the little girl would have to wait long. Delaney had given him a vague answer, and gone to serve another table. The name of that trust was the Table Number 7 Trust. The diner was rebuilt in 7 weeks, and no one in town called it work. People simply came after finishing their own jobs, bringing hammers, bringing saws, even bringing dinners they had cooked at home. A lumberyard in the next town delivered several oak beams and said Delaney could pay later, whenever she was able. The high school students repainted the window frames on a Saturday afternoon, while their parents grilled food outside on the gravel lot for everyone who was working. The fisherman repaired the lower hinge of the front door with his own hands, the hinge that had been crooked for so many years, and afterward it took Delaney several days to break the habit of pushing the door open with her shoulder. The eastern wall was rebuilt from the old stones taken from the ruins themselves, each one set carefully back into place, and beneath the floor, the gray concrete marked with parallel grooves was preserved exactly as it was. No one suggested breaking it apart. Then people began bringing the slips back. They came one at a time, and without ceremony, handing Delaney the yellow slips they had held that morning, and she laminated each one before pinning it back in its original place on the wall behind the counter. Some had faded until the words could no longer be read. Some bore the handwriting of people who were no longer alive. The 6 slips written in that dark, slightly trembling hand were returned to the highest corner near the ceiling, exactly where they had remained for all those years. The wooden sign with the copper spoon was hung above the door again, and beneath the words Elias had carved so long ago, a craftsman from town added one smaller line: "Restored with love, by Ashvale Landing," and the whole town still remembers. On the evening before the diner reopened, Cormac stood with Delaney on the porch for a long time before speaking the truth he had kept inside for 3 years. He said, "Anyone who sits beside me will have their name written into someone else's file, and I have no right to do that to a woman raising a young child." Delaney didn't plead with him, didn't question him, and didn't try to change his mind. She only looked out at the harbor road for a while and said, "Then keep coming on Tuesday mornings. I'll still leave that table empty." The day of June's surgery passed in a waiting room with plastic chairs and a vending machine, and Delaney sat there with Marlene beside her from morning until late afternoon. Then, several weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, Delaney was wiping the table in the corner, as she had done for 3 years when the bell above the door rang. June came running from the back room. In the middle of the diner, the child suddenly stopped. She turned her head toward the door, toward the sound of the bell. For the first time in her life, Delaney stood frozen with the cleaning cloth in her hand. She called her daughter's name. June turned toward her mother, her eyes wide, then spoke, her voice slightly uneven and a little louder than necessary because she wasn't accustomed to hearing herself, but every word was clear. "Mommy, your voice is beautiful." Delaney had to turn toward the kitchen. She stood there with her shoulders trembling, still holding the cloth, and no one in the diner said a word. At table number 7, the man who had just taken his seat stared down at the coffee cup before him and didn't speak either. True power doesn't belong to the person who can tear down a wall in 30 seconds. It belongs to the person who spent 6 years building that wall with small pieces of paper during evenings when no one was watching. And sometimes the kindness we give away on an ordinary morning doesn't disappear at all. It simply sits quietly at a table in the corner, waiting patiently for the day when we need it most. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button, share the video, and subscribe to our channel so that every day we can listen together to more meaningful stories. Please leave a comment below and tell us how you feel about Delaney and the guest at table number 7, because we sincerely want to hear the emotions that come from the deepest places in your heart. May you and your family always be blessed with abundant health, peace, and happiness each day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.